From former champion Petr Yan siding with his rival in the upcoming war, to Sugar Sean's analysis of how Henry's layoff will affect his performance. Let's look at what some of our favorite pros think about the return of Henry Cejudo. The champ thinks he's got it in the bag, but that's no surprise. Aljo's confidence is at an all-time high with the way his last two fights have gone, especially after proving the haters calling his championship fake wrong. He came back to dominate Petr Yan in their rematch after getting beat down in the first fight, and then recorded a stellar performance against Dillashaw that technically ended in a finish for Sterling. That victory over TJ helped to prove to Aljo that he isn't just good against contenders he knows can take on bantamweights from any era and still dominate them. That's where the most successful combat sports athlete of all time steps in. Sterling doesn't have a lot of challenges left in the division, and this will be one of his final tests before officially being done with the 135-pound roster. Of course, the champ isn't dumb enough to take this fight lightly, and he said he fully recognizes the threat Cejudo can present in the early rounds. It may be hard to get Triple C out of there in the first round, but Aljo is confident he can finish the fight in the second. He thinks he'll be able to close the distance between them eventually, and use Henry's own game of wrestling against him. It won't matter if Aljamain can stop the fight with ground and pound or choke Cejudo out in the scramble. He believes he's getting it done before the bell rings at the end of the second round. O'Malley agrees with Sterling that his grappling could outdo Cejudo's. It's unfair that Sterling's name doesn't come up more often when talking about fighters with the best wrestling in the UFC. There's a reason fighters that have been in the cage with him seem to universally agree that Henry isn't going to handle Aljo on the ground. Even though Triple C is an Olympic gold medalist, O'Malley has had a lot to say about Henry recently, and none of it is too positive, because he's been looking to fight the king of cringe himself. For Sean, it's not so much about skill as it is about determination. He's been taking note these past 3 years that Henry has been retired, and it doesn't look like the former double champ has been training too hard. To be fair, why should he? He wasn't an active fighter, he just had a kid, and he's focusing on his analyst gig quite a bit. To O'Malley, Triple C has been looking fat and drunk at all the events he's shown up to, and that's not how you beat someone who's cleared out the entire division, and is the undisputed best 135-pound fighter in the world. But then again, Sean has never fought Henry, so he can't make these claims with much weight behind them. Marlon Moraes, on the other hand, speaks from personal experience. The Brazilian mixed martial artist fought Henry for the title back in 2019 for the bantamweight title. And if you ask me, he gave Cejudo the toughest fight he's had since Mighty Mouse. Of course, we all remember the brilliant adjustments Cejudo made by using the tie clinch and winning the fight. But Moraes was able to neutralize Henry's wrestling pretty effectively. Not to mention, Marlon's the only fighter to ever knock out the Funk Master inside the cage when they fought years ago. With all the experience he has as a fighter and his time in the ring with both Henry and Aljo, make Moraes the right guy to ask who has the upper hand in the upcoming fight. And he thinks the champion is going to retain. Considering how much trouble his reach advantage gave Henry, Marlon thinks Sterling may be too long for Henry to get in close. Cejudo usually has a power advantage in fights, but Sterling is so much bigger than Triple C, walking around at nearly 165 pounds, that he's bound to hit harder as well. The only saving grace for Cejudo is going to be his wrestling, but Marlon believes the two are tied in the wrestling department, and Aljo has the advantage in grappling. With all this hype going in favor of the current champion, you might be wondering why the betting line is so close. It's because many of the analysts think we're going to see an upset at UFC 288. Joe Rogan outlined in detail why Cejudo would end up on top. And what made that conversation exceptionally interesting was Mighty Mouse being the guest on the Joe Rogan Experience that day. And if there's a guy on this earth who can tell you what Henry is made of, it's Johnson. The former UFC champion hasn't just fought Cejudo twice for the championship. He now trains with a former double champion. In contrast to what Sean O'Malley thinks about Henry, Mighty Mouse said he's never seen anyone as disciplined as his new training partner. Johnson said he isn't worried about Cejudo at all, and that he's more than capable of handling anyone in the bantamweight division. Rogan thought the same thing, and said he's been a longtime fan of the uniquely modern approach to MMA training Henry takes. He has a mathematical approach to fighting, so much so that when he looks at a fighter, he analyzes all the situations in which he can beat him and where he's going to be in danger. With all the success Cejudo has over the years, it's safe to say he's also very good at forcing his game plan. At the highest level of the sport, Mighty Mouse thinks the smarter fighter comes out on top, and he hasn't met anyone with a better fight IQ than the only man to beat him in the UFC. Of course, you might say Johnson is a little biased because they're friends now, and Johnson doesn't have much experience with the Funk Master. Petr Yan, on the other hand, has no reason to be rooting for Aljo. No Mercy lost his belt to Aljo in that fateful disqualification, then got dominated in their rematch, only to come back and lose a controversial decision to Sugar Sean. His stint of bad luck started with the knee he threw against Aljamain, yet he still thinks his former opponent has it in the bag. Yan has always been an active fighter himself and thinks that's the key to being effective in the sport. Cejudo will be days away from the 3rd anniversary of his retirement, when he'll fight for the championship. And even if you're working out and keeping fit, not having training camps all those years leads to a certain amount of ring rust. Even though Henry joined the USADA testing pool earlier last year, and he's been preparing for his comeback ever since, it's very likely he hasn't adapted to the sport. We saw something similar when Conor came back against Dustin. The skill was all there, but the sport had evolved too quickly for Conor to follow on the sidelines, and it ended up costing him the fight. Aljo has been actively fighting the very best in the division since Henry retired and honing his skills. So it's not just recency bias that has everyone rooting for the current champ. With such a dominant career, where does Aljo go after the Cejudo fight? Aljamain is very confident that he's going to win that matchup, and he's probably confident because of the size difference between him and Henry. But that's the exact reason Sterling said he isn't going to be fighting at 135 pounds for much longer. The weight cut has started to deplete him way too much, and if he managed to get through Cejudo at UFC 288, he might only fight once more in the division. That fight is already set. It's gonna be the Sugar Show. His victory against Yan catapulted him into the rankings, and even Sterling believes that Sean has done enough to deserve a title shot. Of course, I get why Sterling wants to be the one to fight O'Malley. He's one of the sport's biggest stars, and their fight will generate huge numbers that Sterling will get a share of because of his championship status. A nice payday before he moves up to featherweight is a good idea, because there's no telling how the American is going to do in the bigger weight class. Well, folks, those are the most important predictions for the upcoming bantamweight title clash.